Black Brawn, Captain Flint, Brain Trust, Earl Sanderson, Silver Helix, Chop Chop, Young Troll, Stopwatch, Will-O-Wisp, Turtle, and Xavier Desmond.
All right, here we go. Card Table, Episode 5, Book 4, Aces Abroad. So this one, we got 3 covers to show off. The Brian Bolland British edition, featuring the character Chrysalis, who looks kind of hideous and horrible. A lot of times in the text they describe the idea is that she's got clear skin, so you can see all the sort of the musculature beneath her skin, pulsating, the blood flowing through the veins, the muscles working, and the character Daniel Brennan, aka Yeoman, talks about how he finds it very beautiful. I don't know that the beauty of the idea is captured here. It is a pretty striking image, though, and she is a great character. Then we've got the original paperback version. Oh, you know what? I have 4. Hold on. Here we've got the original paperback edition from Bantam Books. Not with a lot of these early, I think with the first 5 Bantam editions, there are 2. There's these sort of painted kind of collage things where Tachyon is always kind of almost like it's his tourist photos or his slideshow. He's always kind of there off to the side, kind of showing off the rest of the stuff that's happening. These are a little odd. I'm not sure who illustrates these, but the first 5 have these painted covers, and then I don't know exactly what the timeline was, but the Bantam Books, there's also editions of the first 12 books where the wildcard logo, instead of being slanted, is kind of straight across the top, and then all the illustrations are by Tim Truman, and they're more comic booky and less painted, and they're just one sort of scene rather than this sort of collage effect. The color form thing, I called it last time, where it's just sort of like a backdrop, and then we'll stick Tachyon here, and Elephant Girl right here, and maybe that's Gimli, and maybe this is Peregrine again, although her wings are not. Yeah, I don't know who that's meant to be. Maybe that's meant to be Mistral. And then this guy, I believe, is meant to be Le Miroir. Did I say we only have 3 covers? I've got 4 to show off here. I don't have the Tim Truman version, but I do have the sci-fi hardcover book club dealio. I always thought this was kind of a fun cover. The sort of I like the wild cards covers that sort of both play up the fact that there's a lot of sort of fantastical elements, and yet that it's also kind of grounded in the modern day. So having these sort of Egyptian godlike figures, but brandishing modern weaponry, that juxtaposition seems very, very appropriate to wild cards. So I always thought this cover was kind of cool. A little over the top, perhaps, but I don't know. I dig it. And then the Tor edition, which is the edition that you want, because Book 4 is one of the books where, when they re-released it through Tor, they decided to add some new stories, like with Volume 1, where they added 3 new stories. This one, I have a memory that when they first solicited this one, they said the same thing. There would be 3 new stories. When it finally appeared, there are only 2 new stories in the book, but they're both good. And well, here I'll say one thing about. Or here's what I can say about this. The premise of this book involves a world tour where a delegation of aces and jokers and nats. I don't know if I ever said what the nats are in wildcards terminology. Short for natural, meaning someone with no wildcard virus. So neither ace nor joker, just a nat. So various politicians and prominent citizens, both nats and ace and joker, all get on a plane, and sponsored by the World Health Organization, they go on this fact-finding tour of 39 countries or something like that, just to see how the wild card has affected other countries. So when the book originally came out, one of the things or I should say, when I first really started rigorously reading these books, trying to become the foremost wildcard fan, which I'm not sure if I'm there yet, but I'm trying to really become an expert on these things. I sort of wrote down everybody who was on the tour, and then sort of kind of kept track of, when did they get their at least one moment in the book to shine and sort of justify their presence on the tour. I realized there were three characters who it's almost like why are they even there? They don't seem to have affected the content of the books at all. One of them is a Joker named Troll, and then there's an ace named Fantasy, and then there's another ace character, not a delegate, but a part of a security contingent named Lady Black. So when they said, "Oh, they're going to add three new stories," I was like, "Well, one story should be about Troll, one should be about Fantasy, and one should be about Lady Black." And now you've justified everyone who's included in the tour. When they shortened it down to two stories, I was like, well, that means at least one of those three characters is still going to get short shrift. But I should not have doubted the authors. One of the stories is by Carrie Vaughn. It's about Lady Black. And then Kevin Andrew Murphy writes about Troll, who gets the cover. Troll is the lead character, the POV character. But right alongside as pretty much the co-lead is Fantasy. So God bless Kevin Andrew Murphy. He got two into one story. And so now this version, I really do think is much more complete. It makes the book longer. It's already a pretty lengthy read. These editions come out to about 460 something pages, and this larger version is all the way up to 500 something pages. Pretty dense. But I actually think this one probably reads faster because the new stories just kind of liven things up a little bit. So even though technically it's longer, I feel like it actually reads, oddly enough, more efficiently. So kudos to the wildcard authors. I think the additional stories in the tour volume 100% improve the overall experience of the book. So from there, I guess we can just talk about the individual stories a little bit. This one kind of goes back to what I was discussing a little bit with the first volume, where it was pointed out by like some Goodreads reviews, and my hair's doing some weird stuff. Some Goodreads reviews, and maybe some Amazon reviews. Just I sort of was trying to take the temperature of what general fandom has kind of thought of these books, or just the average reader. But they pointed out with the first book that it doesn't feel like a novel, really. It does feel sort of like an anthology of short stories, whereas, to my mind at least, the second volume, even though it's another anthology of short stories, they're so tightly connected in terms of both plot and in terms of just sort of the time scale of it. That the second book really does read like a novel, even though it's technically an anthology of interconnected short stories. And then, of course, the third one is, by any definition, a novel. Just one continuous narrative, starting at chapter 1, ending at chapter 25, and just going through, following the adventures of the seven lead characters, as discussed in the previous videos. This one kind of goes back to the anthology feel, where you shouldn't necessarily read it expecting that all the different stories are kind of going to link up at the end for some kind of cathartic, climactic ending. It really is sort of one story about character X in country Y, and then the next story is about character A in country B, or whatever it is. And really is more leaning into the anthology aspect of Wildcards. They get on a plane at the start of the book. It's set over the course of about 5 months. They leave December 1st, get back April 29th or something like that. I got a lot of those dates in my head, trying to be the foremost expert on wildcards. What can I say? Got to keep the dates in my head. So December of 86 through April of 87 is when the book is set. 5-month tour of the world, checking out how different countries how the wildcard virus has affected different countries, and how those countries' governments are dealing with the people who have been infected by the wildcard virus. So looking at the tour edition, what do we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. about 13 authors. I counted very quickly, but it looks like about 13. So I guess originally it was 11. Um, about I think they say something. They say the exact number of countries, something like 40 countries that they visit, or something like that. Obviously, with 13 authors, you have about 13 stories or so. So only a handful of those 40 countries, only a fraction, I really looked at more in detail. Um, the interstitial narrative is provided by George R.R. Martin, just as with books 1 and 2. That's one of the nice things about these early books is that you get the man himself, the big man. Certainly in terms of font, he's the big man. Um, but the guy that a lot of us are here for, because we love you, George. And he's doing the interstitial on these early books, which is always great. He I get the impression he's very proud of this particular interstitial in an anthology of his own stuff that I believe he curated himself. Um, the only wildcards content, I can't remember what those anthologies are called, but I believe the only wildcards content in those anthologies might be the interstitials from Aces Abroad. So what's up with those interstitials? It's about a character named Xavier Desmond, a Joker. Um, really great character. First shows up in the Turtle story in book 1, which is set in 1963, where he's kind of right away this very cool Joker character, because he's got what could be described as kind of a cartoonish deformity, where his nose is an elephant's trunk with little fingers at the end of the trunk that can theoretically pick up small objects, and is at least somewhat prehensile, I guess. Almost sounds like some kind of cartoon character, but the character is written with a lot of dignity and a lot of class, a lot of intelligence, and I guess that contrast alone, is very is just very nicely considered, well considered, because as in the real world, whatever physical ailment or difference that we might have been born with, it doesn't really reflect who we truly are. I think there's a nice sort of message sort of implied just in the existence of Xavier Desmond. And that kind of even gets at what's going on here. Like I said, this book is set in the mid 80s. So Xavier Desmond, who was kind of a young man in the Turtle story set in the 60s, is now, or at least younger. Now he's quite a bit older. I think he's maybe in his 70s at this point, or 60s. But either way, a very old 60s or 70s. Obviously, we're living in the 2020s now, where, as they say, 60 is the new 40 or whatever, 70 is the new 50, et cetera, et cetera. But this was still the 80s when 70 was just 70, I guess. But he's got sort of a terminal illness, so he kind of knows that he's kind of on his last legs, and so this sort of adventure, this 5-month adventure traveling the world, is sort of going to be his final adventure, and he knows it, and so he's keeping a journal of the whole travel, of the whole trip, and so. The interstitial is titled "From the Journal of Xavier Desmond," so it's meant to be these different excerpts. And later books, he sort of mentions in his journal, that hopefully this will be published after my death. And later books do establish that, yes, there is, in the world of wildcards, there is a published book titled "The Journal of Xavier Desmond." So. Which is kind of a neat conceit, sort of an interesting way to do it. So in the 12 stories that fall in between these interstitials, we get a look at 12 countries, 12 stops on the tour. But during those interstitials, Xavier Desmond's point of view kind of gives us a look at quite a few of the other countries on the tour. Well, there's a lot of things to praise about the writing of those interstitial narratives. I particularly like just the way Martin seems to really enjoy sort of giving us this one man's account of this very variegated, multifaceted fictional universe that has so much variety, mainly thanks to the fact that there's such a variety of authors and authorial voices. It works really nicely to have it filtered through this one character that's being written by Martin. And he's sort of our window into a lot of his journal entries. A lot of them are written during one of the stops on the tour, but there's also parts that where he talks about some of the drama just that occurs kind of on the plane, between the characters as they're en route from one country to another. Um, and of course, all these characters have been created by other writers, and so, but you get to see all their interactions as filtered through one character point of view. Um, the overall effect really gives you a sense that there really is a whole world, that Wildcards is really truly like a 3-dimensional or even 4-dimensional fictional universe, that we're only kind of seeing just a small. Each book kind of just provides us like with one window into some of the events, but that there's a whole bunch of other things going on, beyond our view, beyond the view, provided by the book. That there's a whole world around it, really rich in that way. That's one of the things I really respect about the writing of the interstitial, and kind of about Wildcards just in general. There really is. It's so sort of bursting at the seams with characters and ideas, and it always seems like there's more going on than you're even reading about, which is really an attractive, for obvious reasons, a very attractive element to a fictional world that you want to revisit, that you're revisiting again and again with every new book. So, very good stuff in the interstitials. Again, I know, like I said, I know in the curated. I think in the afterword, again, there's an iBooks version of this that I don't have, where there's a Martin written afterword, and I think he may talk in there about how the Xavier Desmond material in this book is his favorite of his own writing that he's done for Wildcards, at least. Um, so, so not only do you have the recommendation of me, an anonymous YouTube person. My name's Jason, by the way. I don't know if I actually say that on every video. But that's my name if anyone cares. But you not only have my testimonial, but George himself really praises his own writing in this particular volume. So, getting into the individual stories, what have we got? We got what do we got? What do we got here? We got Beasts of Burden. So the first full length story in this one, Beasts of Burden, written by John Joseph Miller, starring. Wait for it. Starring Chrysalis, who up to now has been a supporting character mainly in the John Joseph Miller written Daniel Brennan stories, the Yeoman saga. She's introduced right in the very first Yeoman story, becomes his lover in that very first Yeoman story. Really great character. One of the first, I would argue, one of the first truly badass female characters in the Wildcards universe, because for all that I like about Wildcards, it was a little, if you're talking about just creating cool female characters, a little slow getting off the runway with that agenda. Took a while. I mean, there's a lot of cool female characters in Wildcards, but it took a while for them to start to show up, in my opinion. But I think Chrysalis is like one of the coolest and one of the first. I know Melinda Snodgrass agrees. She said somewhere that she said recently that, and not so recently, I think I've heard her say this a couple times, that she really would like for Chrysalis to be, if the Wildcards television adaptation ever does happen, where they make a television series out of the show or out of the books. I'm not sure where that is at this point. If you follow that saga online, you hear a lot of different stories about just where they are. I think right now it's maybe Peacock is the latest rumor. But anyway, Melinda Snodgrass has said if there is a Wildcards show, she definitely wants Chrysalis to be a character on the show. In fact, when I attended a signing, I think she said that she was sitting right next to George R.R. Martin, and she said something to that effect. And as I mentioned, and as you can see by the illustration, her whole idea is that she has clear skin, so you can see all the blood flowing, all the veins, the muscles working, her throat muscles working every time she talks. George R.R. Martin said something to the effect of, "Well, that would be impossible to have this character be on screen." And she was like, George, there's this thing now called CGI. So that was a fun exchange to witness. So the first country that we look at is Haiti. So it's Chrysalis's story set in Haiti, where she and a couple of the other delegates end up kidnapped by a sort of revolutionary faction, um, or or is it the government faction? There's a lot of stories in here where it's the government versus the rebels, and it's hard sometimes to remember because depending on which country they're in, sometimes the government's the good guys and the rebels are the bad guys, and sometimes it's the opposite. Um, but there's a character, a villain introduced in this story called T. Melisse. Um, my friend John, who I really need to give more shouts out to as I do these videos, because he's the whole reason I got into these books. I never would have read them if not for John. So thank you, John. He and I always called the character Ty Malice. If you see how it's spelled, I don't think you can fault us. And then I saw an online discussion of wild cards, and Walter John Williams started talking about Team Elise, and had one of those moments of disconnect where once again I was like, am I a really good wild cards fan, or am I terrible? I can't think of who that character is, Team Elise. And then I realized, oh, apparently that's the correct way to pronounce Ty Malice. So Team Elise is this sort of evil, kind of parasitic sort of Joker, kind of seems a little bit inspired by like the Puppet Masters, that kind of idea of this sort of little I don't know, globular sort of alien-like creature, but not an alien, a Joker, who could sort of ride you on the back, sticks his mouth into your neck, and takes control of your body and your mind, and sort of you become essentially a puppet of Team Elise. They use the term mount. You're one of his mounts if he manages to get his mouth onto your neck. They can't use the word puppet because of some other stuff that happens in these books. But that character is introduced, although in Beasts of Burden, although they deliberately write it in such a way that, weirdly enough, even though Chrysalis is the lead character and Team Elise is the villain, they never actually meet. She meets sort of people affiliated with Team Elise, while Team Elise himself ends up making a mount out of a different character on the delegation, which is kept mysterious, at least at first. Although by the end of this book, it's pretty clear which guy on the delegation is now a mount. But a fun little story, action-packed. Arguably, Chrysalis works a little better as a supporting character than a lead. At least in a story like this, which is so action-oriented, because sort of by design, she's not really an action hero the way a lot of the Wild Cards characters are. That said, she's a great character, so it's cool to read about her. The story is really fast-paced, really punchy. A lot of, like always with John Joseph Miller, the action is always written very economically, very clearly. You really feel like you're getting like a nice little action movie, in brief, in prose. From there, we go to the Blood Rights by Leanne C. Harper, which is one of the longer stories in here. I know I said at one point when I was reviewing these books for a discussion thread, an internet discussion thread, I thought it was, I think of it more as a novella than just a short story. Very long, sweeping epic, set in Guatemala. Once again, it's about rebels versus the government, because that is a very common motif in this particular book. So in this case, the rebels are the good guys, the government's the bad guys. It's two native Guatemalans, and they sort of lead this revolution against the oppressive Guatemalan government. Leanne C. Harper, I can link to an essay she did for Wild Cards Online, where she talked about the inspiration for this. It's pretty interesting, and she's much more articulate than I can probably be about these two characters who I don't think we ever learn their real names. They sort of spontaneously, even though they're in different parts of the country, they spontaneously sort of develop ace powers that are, and they sort of, in a dream, are told that they're like an incarnation of these mythological or mythical brothers, the hero twins, and then they just take on the names of each one takes on the name of one of those two characters from. And I'd have to Wikipedia to get the name. It's a text. The let me look it up. The Popol Vuh. The Popol Vuh. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's. I could just read the Wikipedia entry. A text recounting the mythology and history of the Quiche people, one of the Maya peoples who inhabit Guatemala, as well as areas of Belize and Honduras. The Popol Vuh or the Popol Vuh, and it includes the Mayan creation myth, the Mayan creation myth, and the exploits of the hero twins, Hnapu and Sbalanque. I'll apologize one time for the fact that I can't pronounce any words, but at a certain point, that probably starts to sound like a little like I'm just making excuses. So one more blanket apology as I butcher these names, but I am trying. So they sort of they take on those names, Balanque and Hunapu, and those are the only names we ever know those characters by, and they sort of experience in kind of a vision dream that they know that the other one exists. So even though they're on like sort of different sides of the country, they sort of head to meet each other, and as they do, they both have ace powers. One of them is a teleporter. One of them has sort of concussive sort of ability where they can sort of hurl projectiles, which then hit with sort of the force of explosives or a bomb, grenades, whatever. So they sort of are sort of fighting the government as they go, and their exploits become somewhat celebrated, and they gather followers. So by the time they finally meet together, they've already both have their big groups of followers. And right around that time is when the ACE, the World Health Organization delegation, our lead characters, show up, and they sort of meet with the hero twins briefly. So they sort of explain that they're just on a fact-finding mission and can't do much, can't really offer any kind of American aid to their rebel movement. And then the WHO delegation, the WHO delegation just kind of flies off and heads to the next country on their itinerary, and kind of leaves the hero twins to keep on fighting, just unaided with no help from the American governments or anyone else. So kind of a other than the fact that it's obviously kind of a coincidence that that the tour just happens to land right as this insurrection is happening, it's kind of cool that in a way it's kind of cool that it's just sort of its own story, and the fact that the WHO delegation shows up in a couple scenes is almost incidental. I feel like I've read online reviews where they kind of criticize that element, but I actually think, it's more realistic. The previous story had Chrysalis and a couple other characters getting kidnapped, like almost the moment they set foot in Haiti. There's a couple other stories where we'll see some similar things, but every story can't involve the tour getting endangered. Like as soon as they land, we're still landing in civilized countries here, so I actually like the fact that it's not really about anybody on the tour. It's just sort of something that's happening in Guatemala roughly around the same time that the tour arrives. So cool story. I think Harper, and again I'll link to her essay where she talks about kind of the inspirations for writing the story. She seems to have a real affinity for that stuff, and a real fascination with it, and I think that comes through in the writing. I think it's really evocative, really enjoyable a good entry. From there, from Blood Rights, we move on to, oh, you know what? I'm looking at I need to look at the tour one, so I make sure I get the newly interpolated stories, because I think right after Blood Rights comes one of the interpolated stories. Yeah, Warts and All by Kevin Andrew Murphy. So this is a story that wasn't originally in the book. Written by Kevin Andrew Murphy. Troll is the main character. He gets the cover. And Fantasy, another character that I mentioned, who didn't really get much to do when this book first hit the stands, even though it's clear that she's on the tour. So cool that we finally see something involving Troll and Fantasy, and it's pretty cool story actually. So this one is set. I should have kept notes because I keep losing my Peru, right? In Peru, and Kevin Andrew Murphy did I'm bad with terminology. When it comes to role playing games, I'm horrible with terminology. So a guidebook, I guess you would say, or a campaign. I should have brought it. I do have it on the shelf. But it was called Aces Abroad, just the same as the book. But I guess just it had some character. It had a bunch of characters in it, like character profiles of Wildcards characters that already existed as part of the sort of the established canon. But then also had a lot of characters that Kevin Andrew Murphy invented for gameplay, I guess. Whatever that exactly means, because I've never done role playing in my life. But none of the stuff that he invented for that Aces Abroad campaign role playing game campaign book was canon when that book was published necessarily. But I know I've talked to him a little bit on Facebook, and he's talked just generally about how he sort of has imported some of those characters that maybe first appeared in that game book after he wrote that, became a writer for the series, and was able to import some of those characters into the official canon. So we get a little of that in. He sort of comes full circle, finally gets to write for the actual book Aces Abroad, not just for the RPG Aces Abroad, and so he brings in I think all three of these characters are characters he created for the game book. Two of them definitely are. I think maybe all three, and they are Kokomama, Curare, and the Messenger in Black. The Messenger in Black is a character who's sort of made of butterflies, sort of a mysterious character. We never get inside his head, at least we haven't yet, so it's not clear exactly what this entity is. But in terms of how others perceive him, he's just sort of a flock of butterflies that when the butterflies, sort of enough of them sort of all collect, you sort of see a general outline of a humanoid figure, kind of shadowy and vague, but he's there, seemingly comprising hundreds of butterflies. I don't know if that description makes it sound cool, but in the actual book, it's a really cool idea, and you get to see Michael Comark's kind of hinting at the existence of the Messenger in Black with all these. Man, Comark is so good, isn't he? I love his covers because you kind of notice more details the more you really examine. I mean, he's got all these great butterflies, and then as you zoom in, you start to see the really cool backgrounds and stuff. He's good. I'm telling you, he's good. But yeah, I really, yeah, it's a great cover. But yeah, the Messenger in Black, very cool character. And then Coco Mama is a character who weeps cocaine, as it were. Sort of the tears that she sheds are she's like a natural source of addictive substances, and so to potential drug lords, she's a very valuable commodity. She's a child in this story, and then also a child is her sort of friend and I guess protector, sort of frog-like Joker ace called Curare, who in the Aces Abroad game book, they're both adults in the 1980s, but I imagine. I think I asked Kevin, and I think he said that he made them children in this book, so that in the present day, since this book came out in like 2015 or whatever, a book actually set in 2015, they could still be around. I think that was the logic. And they do show up again. All three of the characters, Messenger in Black, Curare, and Coco Mama, do actually show up in a book set in 2012, um, which is, what is it? High Stakes. Um, so what's my point there? I guess my point is, well, they're really cool characters. I love Murphy's description of them. I'm never sure. Some of these writers I've interacted with, so it's like, do I call them by their first name or is that presumptuous? So Kevin's writing is great, or Mr. Murphy's writing is great, whichever you prefer. Um, and he has a lot of great character ideas, and Curare, this sort of poison frog kind of character, is really cool. He's described as oh, here's, by the way, Kevin, if you're watching, because I know it's not canon yet, but in the Aces Abroad guidebook, I went back and looked. You actually give a birth date for Curare of March 7th, and that's my birth date. So, and he's even now that you've made him a kid in 1986. I was a kid in 1986, so now he might even have the same birth year as me. So let's talk sometime in private. I don't want to totally give away all my personal information, but I'd really like to make it canon that there's a character in Wildcards who has my exact birth date, both the date and the year. It seems like Curare is poised to be that guy. So let's talk. Let's see if we can find a way to get Curare's birth date actually canonized in a future novel, and let's make it mine. That's all I'm saying. It's a cool story. It also takes advantage of the fact that when they get to book 5, they do this. There's actually a little preface in book 5 where they're like, in the real world, things in New York City, which is where most of these books are set, would not just grind to a halt just because several people went on this world tour. So now we're going to show you what happened in New York from December to April, while these people were on the tour. So part of book 5 is actually set at the same time as book 4. Murphy kind of takes advantage of that because book 5 is, as I mentioned before, is all about the gang war between the Shadow Fists and the Mafia. So Murphy actually connects that to the events happening in Peru, where the Shadow Fists are actually trying to get their hands on Coco Mama, who again is this natural source of drugs, trying to kidnap her out of Peru, get her back to New York. And Fantasy has already, the character Fantasy, who's on the tour because she's a famous ballerina, but secretly she's actually in league with Kian. She's Kian's lover. She's affiliated with the Shadow Fists. That's already established canon from a story in Volume 2. So perfect way to sort of give everything a nice sense of cohesion, where part of what she's doing on the tour is actually serving the interests of Kian and the Shadow Fists. And so when they make this stop in Peru, she sort of seduces Troll and kind of feeds him a bit of a false narrative, since Troll's a good guy, saying, oh, we have to rescue this little girl from this drug lord, get her to New York. She doesn't say that once the girl gets to New York, she's actually going to be just the prisoner of a different drug lord. So very clever, very, very well handled, very entertaining story. Great addition to the book. I think enriches the book in a lot of nice ways. Nothing but a positive effect on Aces Abroad. The next one is Down by the Nile, which is by Gail Gerstner Miller, the creator of Peregrine, wife of John Joseph Miller. Peregrine, Gail Gerstner Miller was part of the original group that was playing the Super World role-playing game, where they created a lot of the characters that became Wildcards characters. Gail, the character that Gail Gerstner Miller created, was, of course, Peregrine. And Peregrine's been a part of the Wildcards universe going back a couple books, but this is the first time we get a story written by her creator, written from Peregrine's point of view. Though we don't learn Peregrine's real name, she's just always Peregrine. I believe, speaking of High Stakes, I believe High Stakes is the first time we actually see her name, her real name, canonized. I'm not even going to say what it is because I'm not sure, because I actually haven't seen it in print that often. But anyway, so Peregrine and Fortunato, the pimp from the first three books, they at one point in volume three get it on, and there's well, when you go back and read the sex scene, that sounds awful, doesn't it? And really read it in very close detail, like I have. You can kind of see the hint of it, but the notion that she might have gotten pregnant from that encounter. But this story confirms it. This story that's set about 3 months after the events of Volume 3. She her power is that she just has a pair of wings. She's sort of like she's the what would you call her? I don't know, like the Madonna of the Wild Cards universe, sort of the ultimate like kind of 80s sex symbol in the Wild Cards universe. Media star, former Playmate, or Playboy model, now a talk show host, and a model, and head of a multimedia empire, all that stuff, and also sort of the considered sort of the quintessence of yeah, like she would be on in the Wild Cards universe. She'd be like number one on like the 50 most beautiful people in America, or 50 most beautiful people in Hollywood, or any magazine publishing a list like that. In the Wild Cards universe, it would be Peregrine number one on the cover. So that's her kind of role in the Wild Cards universe, and her gimmick is that she has these kind of beautiful angel wings, and her power is that she has the power of flight. Does that do anything for you? The power of flight. So the first thing that happens in this story, or one of the first things, is that she tries to take to the air at one point and just kind of falls kind of flat on her face, and her power is failing her for some reason, and it turns out that it's a symptom of pregnancy. And so she gets diagnosed, and it turns out she is indeed pregnant. And it happens to all of this kind of goes down during the Who tour's stop in Egypt, where she meets with a group of aces and jokers called the Temple of the Living Gods, who are essentially have been assembled by a particular character. I don't recall his name, but he sort of has been spending a decade or two gathering. Anytime an ace emerges in Egypt with a power that is that sort of matches part of the ancient Egyptian pantheon of gods, he sort of gathers them and says, "You are the modern incarnation of that god." And any joker who a joker is born with the jackal head or whatever, again, resembling again whatever god that matches up to. This guy, finds him and says, "You just look like that god. You are the modern incarnation of that god. Come and join us at the Temple of the Living Gods." And so over the years has assembled this sort of pantheon. And so the ace delegation, including Peregrine, visits them, and one of them, who has the ability to see the future, tells her, "I know you're pregnant, and I just want you to know that your baby will be happy and healthy," and gives her an amulet and says, "When the time is right, you have to give your son this amulet." And lots of, and then the story just kind of more or less ends. There's some soap opera kind of drama between Peregrine and her boyfriend, and there's also there's a bit of action, a bit of a terrorist attack by the followers of the Nur al-Allah, who's a character that I'll get to in a second. But the big sort of question at the core of it is what's going on with this prophecy and this pregnancy, and we don't get an answer to that. And amazingly, we don't get an answer to that for years and years, until it really doesn't all fully get explicated until volume, I want to say 19. This is volume 4. So the Wildcards writers, and I pointed this out in some of my essays on Tor.com, they really like to play the long game. They keep you waiting for a long time sometimes, but the payoff usually is worth the wait, or at least for me, it always seems that the payoff not only worth the wait, but sort of is better because they made you wait, because it makes it feel all the more epic when it finally when the answers finally come. So from there, from that story, we go into the Tint of Hatred, which is actually they serialized Tint of Hatred a little bit. There are little small little like 3 or 4 page little interludes called like the Tint of Hatred Part One, Tint of Hatred Part Two, by Stephen Lee, sort of getting you primed, and then eventually we do actually get to Syria as the country where it's set, and we get to the country of Syria, and we get the full story titled Tint of Hatred. I think Part Four is the one that's really like a full length story about Greg. Well, I guess at this point, yeah. I didn't want to spoil it when I was talking about the first book because they kind of disguise it. But Puppet Man, the sort of evil ace who sort of can make people into his puppets that he can kind of exercise quite a degree of control over. In the first book, I think they kind of mask who Puppet Man is because there's a couple characters it might be. There's the Joker, Gimli, and then there's the politician, Greg Hartman. And they sort of try to steer you towards the notion that Gimli is the puppet master, but then of course it turns out that it's Greg Hartman. I already knew it because I read the books out of order, so I don't know. I have no idea how much of a feint that really is. It probably is pretty clear, even if you didn't know, even if you don't know going in. But certainly by book 4, you already know it. So I do apologize if anyone's watching these sort of still wondering about whether they want to read these books, and now they just had something spoiled. But I guess you kind of knew going in that might happen. But anyway, so Greg Hartman, who at this point is a successful politician, has thanks to the many people that he has kind of under his control. He's been able to hide the fact that he's a wild card, so no one knows that he's secretly an ace with this power. But he sort of has a lot of the support of wild cards because he's this sort of pro wild cards candidate, pro wild cards politician who at this point he has a lot of, I guess, sort of heat his career. There's a lot of talk that he might run for president in '88. And it's clear, the way they talk about it, that they are building towards that story, and that does become the story in Volume 6 of the sort of Hartman for president sort of campaign, and the threat of this evil puppet master becoming president, which I guess maybe seems a little on the nose these days, but so at this point, Greg Hartman is sort of just trying to get some good works under his name. He's sort of the main guy, who organized this tour in the first place. And he ends up in Syria, where there's a character called the Nur al-Allah, which means the light of Allah, a wild card who has the ability, kind of similar to Puppet Man's, where he's able to sort of control people with his voice, where if you hear him speak, he's got this voice that sort of hypnotizes you, and that's sort of his secret weapon in his sort of demagoguery and his sort of slow build up of followers, and so he's sort of this character who's building up a power base in the Middle East. Through the machinations of the story, he ends up meeting with Greg Hartman and some of the aces on the tour. And there's basically the threat that the Nur al-Allah is just going to go full terrorist and just possibly just kill everybody who's shown up, Hartman and all the aces. And then Hartman, since his own power gives him a slight edge, he's actually able to turn things in his favor. Partly because the Nur al-Allah has a sister who's also a wild card, an ace with the ability of prophecy, and he ends up taking her as a puppet and forcing her to sort of turn on her brother at a crucial moment. She slits his throat, which doesn't kill him, but ruins or at least badly damages his voice, which is the thing that he uses to control people. So he ends up surviving, but certainly if your throat gets cut, you're not going to you've lost your edge at the moment. So he gets kind of dragged off as blood is pouring down his throat. His bodyguards and his people drag him away. The day is sort of saved. The whole thing works out kind of in Greg Hartman's favor because, of course, nobody knows that he's an ace. So what they all saw was just this brave human politician facing down this wild card terrorist with nothing but sort of grit and guts and determination. So it's his political cachet is increased, which seems like a good thing to all the wildcards who think that he's just this philanthropic sort of pro-wildcard candidate. And of course, we readers know that it's actually anything that's getting him closer to the presidency is actually horrible. So that's that one. Good stuff. I'll get to that at the end. We'll just keep going through the stories. Teardrop of India, which when I was younger, I think I first read these, like I said, I think I was 13 or maybe even 12 reading these. And a lot of stuff went over my head, sometimes really obvious stuff, like the fact that, it's the Teardrop of India, so that's set in India. Actually, the Teardrop of India is one of the names for Sri Lanka. So the story is actually set in Sri Lanka. It's one of the few places where they don't end up attacked by terrorists or involved, or there's no rebel insurgency or anything like that going on at that particular time, or at least if there is, the delegation doesn't get caught up in it for once. But a movie is being filmed featuring the great ape, the King Kong-like figure who makes the cover of book 2 in several different editions. It turns out that the great ape is actually a human being who was infected by the wild card. We learn a lot more about that character in some later stories, but he becomes kind of actually a pretty major character in Wild Cards, a very significant one who recurs a lot, created by Walton Simons, who writes The Teardrop of India. But in this story, he's more of a plot device. He's just a giant ape that a character named Jaywardine. I'm going to say Jaywardine I'm going to pronounce it Jaywardine, who's not so secretly an ace. Although in later books, it's not very common knowledge that he's an ace. So I guess he's another sort of secret up the sleeve, as the lingo in the books goes. Although he's not too secretive about it here. He seems pretty free with just telling everybody he knows that he is indeed a wild card with the power of precognition, visions of the future, just like the hero twins had, just like the Nur Allah's sister had. There are some motifs that repeat quite a bit over the course of Aces Abroad. Rebels versus the government is one. Rebel terrorists, that's a very common motif. Characters whose wild card affliction is related to religion. Again, the Nur Allah, the living gods in Egypt, the hero twins, once again, related to their local mythology or religion. And then precognition, another big one. We've already seen a couple times visions of the future, or just visions, which we see with the Kahina, which is Nur Allah's sister, the hero twins again, and now with Jaywardine. So some repeated motifs. I'd say it's one of the things that's maybe a knock against Aces Abroad, because it does feel a little redundant at times. But hey, what are you going to do? So Jaywardine and Dr. Tachyon and some of the other characters on the tour, Golden Boy, Elephant Girl, basically try to subdue the great ape. He's in Sri Lanka because they're filming a movie about a giant ape, of course. The ape escapes. Tachyon, Golden Boy, Elephant Girl, and Jaywardine manage to subdue the ape, and then Tachyon is able to sort of reach into the ape's mind and sort of trigger a transformation back into human, and the character reverts back to a human named Jeremiah Strauss. I guess I'm kind of spoiling. I'm in the past I haven't been quite so spoilery with these stories. I guess I should stop doing that, eh? All right, going forward, no spoilers, no spoilers. Next is Down in the Dream Time by Edward Bryant. So this is one a bit like Blood Rights in the fact that the tour, the delegation, doesn't really get that involved in the story. The story is set in Australia, kind of roughly around the time that the tour kind of lands in Australia, hits New Zealand, and then is off. And it's just sort of coincidental, because really the story is about the character Cordelia Chasson, who is the niece of Sewer Jack, Edward Bryant's character from the earlier volumes. She's working for a media conglomerate of some sort, and she's sent to Australia to just do some stuff. It actually doesn't matter too much, because the idea is that there's a wild card who is able to occupy the dream time, which is that sort of Aboriginal concept. Once again, the spirituality of the native spirituality of the country plays a big part in the wild card powers of the people. Once again, there's some visions involved, but Cordelia, so this evil woman with a name I can't pronounce, but she's the trapdoor spider woman or something like that. It's the Murgamugai. It's probably not how it's supposed to be pronounced, but it's something like that. She wants to kill Cordelia mainly because she sees Cordelia as just someone from the West, an imperialist. Westerners are all the same kind of attitude. Ends up getting protected by another ace, an Aboriginal. I can't remember what Aboriginal tribe he's from. I should have checked that. But a native Australian. I guess we can call him that. An original Australian, who is also, his power too involves sort of liaison, or being able to sort of interface with what they call the dream time, and he sort of protects Cordelia, and sort of there's a love affair that sparks between Cordelia and this character Wayangare, is how I'm choosing to pronounce it, and I guess that's all you need to know, because I'm trying to not spoil as much, but it's Cordelia and Wayangare versus the trapdoor spider lady in the Aboriginal Dreamtime in Australia. That's all you really need to know, right? That's enough to whet your interest, to pique your interest. Then we get 0 Hour. 0 Hour is set in Japan, which is where Fortunato, and I guess at this point, I sort of have to spoil the ending of previous books. Fortunato, at the end of the previous book, after his big showdown with the astronomer, I won't spoil exactly how that goes down, I guess, but there is a big showdown with the astronomer at the end of book 3, is sort of his arch nemesis, and at the end of that, he decides that he has a lot to learn, so he goes to a monastery in Japan to start learning. And so when the tour arrives in Japan, it's the perfect opportunity for Peregrine to find him and sort of tell him that she's pregnant with his child. Although not much really comes of that, other than the fact that Fortunato, now he knows that. But then there ends up being this situation with the Yakuza, with Hiram Worcester getting not quite accidentally, but he sort of blunders into it. He sort of blunders into a situation where he owes quite a bit of money to the Yakuza for some services rendered, and there's this whole situation where they're going to send an assassin after him called Zero. Uh, an ace assassin is going to kill him if he doesn't pay up, and so Peregrine asks Fortunato for help in dealing with it. So it's a Fortunato adventure, an adventure of Fortunato, who it's kind of actually his last hurrah, at least for a long time in Wildcards. He's a huge figure in the first three books, and thanks to Zero Hour, he's a significant figure in the fourth book too. And then after that, he's kind of written out. I actually think this is the best Fortunato story. I actually like it much better than anything from the first three volumes with him. I think it's the most tense and exciting one. I don't know. I wasn't there at the start. I know George R.R. Martin has said something about how he's like, yeah, back when Wild Cards was first around, everyone's favorite character was either Tachyon or Fortunato, which he calls the wimp and the pimp, and that was like a running joke. Like everyone either likes the wimp or the pimp. I don't know. Neither one is a particular favorite for me. I mean, I have nothing against either character exactly, but I don't know. For me, it was kind of Mark Meadows or the turtle. So it's never really about the wimp or the pimp for me. It was the druggie versus the VW buggy. That said, in this particular book, yeah, definitely some of my favorite stories in this are the Fortunato story is one. It's just it's really good. Like all the Fortunato stories, it's by Louis Shiner, and just very what's the right word? It's real pacey, and the whole threat of this ace assassin called Zero has got there's a real sense of impending doom with it. This sort of countdown that Hiram is going to be killed at exactly midnight or whatever. This sort of race against time with Fortunato. Yeah, really good. One of the best stories in here, I would say. Really a big fan of it. A good way for Fortunato to go out, I think, because it really is. I think his finest hour, I guess. I don't mean to be punny on that, since the story is called Zero Hour, but I guess if the pun fits, we'll lean into it. Hey, then we get the second of the interpolated stories, Always Spring in Prague, set in Prague, Czechoslovakia. Stars Lady Black, who at this point in the series, I think originally Book 4 might be the first appearance of Lady Black, but in the original version of Volume 4, she's such a non-presence. So I think it's great that Carrie Vaughn decided to make her a lead character in this. And it's a great story, really entertaining one. Basically involves what I guess in video game terminology, it's kind of a side quest where Lady Black just does a favor for one of the politicians that's part of the delegation. She sort of says right at the start, this isn't, I'm just a bodyguard. I'm not supposed to go on like errands to help out, to, personal errands for a politician. But, this lady says, look, my friend's daughter ran away. She's in Prague. Just want you to make sure she's okay. And then ends up getting involved in this sort of, another revolutionary movement, although there's, unlike with some of the other stories, it's kind of a red herring in this one, the whole revolution part. But there's still some action. Billy Ray, the character Carnifex, who I guess I probably haven't talked about him yet either, because he, at this point, isn't a lead character yet, but he's a character created by John Joseph Miller, has only played a supporting role at this point. Plays a role in John Joseph Miller's Beasts of Burden, the Chrysalis story, and then Carrie Vaughn makes him a pretty important secondary character in her story. Where Lady Black, because Lady Black and Carnifex are both there sort of as security, working for the Scare Agency, which is sort of the U.S. government's wild card related department. The U.S. government's, the wild card department of the U.S. government is called Scare. The Special Committee of Ace Resources and Endeavors. So Lady Black is part of that agency. So is Billy Ray. aka Carnifex. Lady Black's real name is Joanne Jefferson. And yeah, it just gives this character who originally was entirely kind of off to the side, and makes her lead, and is really cool, really enjoyable story. Uh, some nice little twists and turns. Another highlight, like I say, that the two new stories in this book just do nothing but improve it, in my opinion. From there, you go to Puppets. So this is, as the title suggests, it's another Puppet Man story, but this one is not created or not written by Puppet Man's creator, Stephen Lee, or Lay, but instead is written by Victor Milan, who has created a character named Sarah Morgenstern, who is a reporter who is the one person who, at this point in the chronology of the Wildcards universe, the first person to suspect that Greg Hartman is actually not is more than what he seems. So as you might expect, the character interacts a lot with the Greg Hartman character, and so we actually see quite a bit of her. She's actually a POV character in Tint of Hatred, the Stephen L. story, and now she's also an important character in Vic Milan's Puppets, as is Greg Hartman himself. Puppets is my favorite story in this volume. I really love it. It involves Greg Hartman getting kidnapped by terrorists, because almost every story has terrorists or rebels. He gets kidnapped by terrorists, and it's so. Actually, in the afterword, in George R.R. Martin's afterword, he actually sort of laments some of the editorial choices in this book, and he says something to the effect of, having Greg Hartman get kidnapped twice in two different countries on the tour, maybe that's a little much. But the writers actually do use that to their advantage. It actually becomes actually kind of an important plot point, because essentially what happens in this story is very similar to what happens in the other story, where Greg Hartman's able to use his puppet man power to sort of make this group of terrorists. There's there's quite a few, like 8 or 9 members. A few of them are part of one particular group, a German group, and then there's this group of American Jokers, led by Gimli, who are part of the Jokers for a Just Society, which is an American Jokers' rights organization, a very militant one. So it's the group that's kidnapped Hartman is actually kind of a Frankenstein group. There's also like a member of a Russian intelligence agency involved in the kidnapping. So because there's these different factions, Greg Hartman is able to use the puppet man power to sort of make them turn against each other, or desert each other or whatever. There ends up being this huge massacre with Greg Hartman as seemingly the only survivor. And so he doesn't actually need to be rescued by the time the authorities finally rescue him. He's actually is actually fine. And so in later books, that kind of becomes a plot point as one or two characters here or there are sort of realizing that Greg Hartman is actually sinister. They try to convince other people, and they say, "Hey, look, when he escaped from the Nur al-Allah in Syria, sure, you could say, oh, a little bit of grit, a little bit of luck. Sure, this normal guy who's just a politician with no superhuman powers could escape from an ace terrorist surrounded by people with guns. It could happen." But then it happens again in Berlin. And the same thing happens, that all these armed terrorists and people with ace powers end up just killing each other and turning on each other, just like what happened with the Nur's sister. Come on. And so it's actually used as a plot point where people are trying to say, look, once you could explain it as just a really lucky stroke, but when the same thing happens twice, doesn't that make you wonder if maybe Greg Hartman's more than he seems? So even though George R.R. Martin does kind of lament that choice of having Hartman appear in two very similar stories in one book, I think they turn that to their advantage. Plus, puppets. Um, I guess I didn't say at the beginning that it's set in Germany, but somewhere in there I mentioned that it's in Berlin. Um, uh, Puppets is just so damn good. I love Vic Milan's writing. He's just excels at this kind of like action, this political intrigue, action storyline involving political terrorists and stuff. Very much Vic in his element, I think. And it's just so cool. So it's like, okay, maybe having Greg Hartman being kidnapped twice, I can see why you think that's a bad idea. But when the second time is so damn cool, you know, I think that justifies anything as long as the quality is there. Why not? He can be kidnapped again and again. Then we get to Mirrors of the Soul, so we're getting near the end of the tour. So that's why we're in Europe at this point. We had the Always Springtime in Prague, and then stop in Berlin. So now we're in Paris, France. And Tachyon is our POV character, but also Golden Boy, the Walter John Williams creation, is a POV character in this one. After the events of book one, which I can't remember how much detail I went into, but I realize I'm not being very consistent when I talk about these stories, where sometimes I'm a little vague about actually what happens, and apparently sometimes I just go page by page and tell you exactly what happened. But at the end of the stories in book one, Tachyon and Golden Boy are both they don't like each other. Well, Tachyon really doesn't like Jack Golden Boy Braun, but they end up through a set of extreme circumstances. They end up having to team up in this story against terrorists. Because no matter where you go, apparently in the 80s, every country had some terrorists, and this wildcards delegation just couldn't help getting involved each time. So once again, there's terrorists, and I guess I guess I won't spoil it for now, even though it'll have to be spoiled when I talk about later books. But essentially, Tachyon finds himself at odds with this terrorist faction, and sort of forced by circumstance to enlist Golden Boy to help him, the one guy that he really hates. And I think Melinda Snodgrass is in top form with that, with Mirrors, with this particular story, which the title is Mirrors of the Soul. I think Melinda Snodgrass is in really top form. Just really great clockwork plotting, really precise, clever plotting. Somewhere online, actually, it's probably not up anymore. There was I don't remember if it was a Facebook post or a blog post, but Melinda Snodgrass said something like, how of all the different writing she's done, she's done novels, she's written screenplays, she's written teleplays. She wrote for Star Trek: The Next Generation. And she's like, the short story is my weakest. She's like, that's the thing that I never feel comfortable with. And I was so shocked to hear her say that, because when you look at the first volume where she writes, what's the name of that story? What is the name of that story? Degradation Rights. And then the second one, which is called Relative Difficulties, which is her Tachyon story in book 2. And then this one, Mirrors of the Soul. I think all three are just top notch. And I actually told her that. I was like, I mean, they fit together like clockwork. They're so well considered, both in terms of character and in terms of story mechanics and plot. And she probably thought I was just sucking up. I mean, she was very gracious in accepting the compliment, but she was like, well, I think I might have mentioned those stories by name, and she was like, I haven't read those stories in a while. Like I say, she was very gracious about it. She was kind of like, maybe you're right. I haven't read those stories in a while, but I would be pretty surprised if they were as clockwork perfect as you're trying to say. But Melinda, if you're watching, I stand by that. I stand by it. I love all three stories. I think they're fabu, and that's it. And then Michael Cassett does a very short story that's almost more like an epilogue or really almost more like a prologue to what happens in the next few books. Actually, really entertaining, but very brief, and it involves sort of some fallout from some of the earlier stories. But it is cool. It's set in England, but it's not really much about England. It's actually about well, actually, the first part of it is set in Russia, and it sort of involves the Russian agent who was part of the Berlin kidnapping in the Vic Milan story. He sort of reports to his authority to some superior, some people who are above him in the hierarchy of Russian intelligence, and creates the suspicion in one particular Russian agent that something is up with Hartman. So, like I was saying before, like looking at the facts and going, boy, so Hartman got out of these two situations without a scratch, somehow just by luck. There's something fishy going on here. And as it turns out, this guy also has an affiliation with Tachyon that goes back to the 50s. And there's this sort of reveal that Tachyon was actually an agent an agent for the Russian government at a time when he had been deported from the United States. And we don't actually learn a lot about that particular period in Tachyon's life. There's sort of an implication that maybe he had an adventure or two as a Russian spy, but anyway, the idea is that back then he was sort of, his status was left that he was like a sleeper agent, that actually at any time the Russians could come back and say, hey, you're still working for us and we need you. And so that's kind of what happens, is that this Russian agent, since he suspects something about Tachyon, the tour happens to be in England, and this guy just sort of goes to England and says, all right, Tachyon, time to call in the favor. You know, you need to tell me everything you know about Greg Hartman. And then the story takes like some twists from there. It's short, but there's still some little twists and turns in there. And then that's pretty much it. And so the book kind of leaves you. It's the first book of the next triad, which ended up becoming it sort of expanded as it sort of grew in the telling, this particular arc. So what should have gone through books 4, 5, and 6 in practice, if you actually read the books, goes through books 4, 5, 6, and 7. So it's not really a triad anymore. It's more of they call it a quartet, I think, in these volumes. They call it the Puppet Man Quartet, which I guess, what else would you call it? A quadrilogy. But really, there's a lot of quartets. There's really, and I would argue, more quartets than triads in the Wildcard saga. I think I've said something like that in one of the tour essays, that I deviate from the official designations for some of these arcs, that they call triads. That I think you could argue that there are more quadrilogies than trilogies. But this is the first of a 4-book cycle. So, as you might expect, there are definitely some loose ends. So you get to the end of it, and Puppet Man. Nobody yet has really figured. Well, a few people here and there have their suspicions about Greg Hartman, but no one's actually figured out that he's. And even the ones who have their suspicions are just suspecting that he's hiding some kind of secret ace power, but they don't necessarily suspect that he's not just an ace, but really, really evil. So, and the book kind of opens with Sarah Morgenstern, the reporter who believes that Puppet Man is evil, and so you sort of think, well, if it's almost on page 1, with a character kind of saying like, "I'm going to get you, Greg. I'm going to prove to the world that you're evil," you might think that by page 525, she would either have accomplished that goal or failed spectacularly. But instead, it's just kind of like still just sort of we're just kind of in the middle of that. Haven't reached any kind of catharsis or conclusion. T. Melise, the other sort of puppet master in this book, introduced very early on in Beasts of Burden, which is the first full story in the volume. Again, so you figure introduced right away as a really important or really significant threat. Maybe by the end of the book, he'll be dispatched. But no, he's sort of introduced. You find out that he managed to make his way to America. And now he's just in America causing trouble. in certain ways, the book does kind of leave you a little bit like, you know, um, I want satisfaction, and you really have to kind of go through the next couple books to really get that closure. Um, I will say, no, I mean, I've already been talking for a while, um, and haven't even gotten to books 5, 6, or 7 yet. But if you read that whole arc, particularly in my opinion, if you read them really close together, like sort of, um, you know, hollow out some time to not just read volume 4, but read volume 4, 5, 6, and 7. Because as a saga, I think it's really satisfying when you get to the end. But if you just read volume 4 by itself, you get a lot of very satisfying individual stories, but you don't come to any real climax at the end. It kind of leaves you on some cliffhangers. Um, so that, depending on what you're after, that could be a knock against it. But it is a saga with ongoing plot threads, so probably expect it a little bit too. Overall, I think the main knock against it is those repeated motifs. Even George R.R. Martin says in his afterword that he wishes, I think he says, like, I wish I'd cracked the editorial whip a little harder. Because, there is that sort of sense of, another guy who has visions of the future, or, another story about the rebel faction who's trying to bring down the government, apparently in every country in the world. Not to sound naive, I mean, I realize that that's because that kind of is the reality, but when every story you have to be reintroduced, like, okay, now we're in another country. Okay, what's the deal here? Rebel terrorists trying to bring down the government again. That element, the fact, all the wild cards whose power and or mutation is somehow derived from the local mythology or spirituality or religion. There's a little of that I don't think I even mentioned in Beasts of Burden too, with the story set in Haiti, where there's like some voodoo elements. So there's a character who sort of her power is kind of tied into voodoo and those gods. So there is, I think the first time I read it, I was more bothered by that stuff, by those kind of repeated motifs. Obviously, you could argue that it's actually a strength of the book and that it creates a sense of kind of unity, that there are repeated motifs in these stories, which is sort of how I look at it now. I mean, because I've been trying to sort of, for these videos and just for the tour essays and just for my own enjoyment, I've been reading and rereading the books. And generally, I would say every book gets better on reread. That's one of the really cool things about the Wildcard series, is that I don't think there's a single book that gets worse when you reread it. I think every book you notice more because there's so many interesting details and stuff. So I think every book actually improves on reread, which is pretty remarkable. I mean, it's 29 books. You'd think maybe one of them would maybe not stand up to that scrutiny, but for me personally, every book I actually like more when I read it a second time, or more than that, a third or fourth time. And that's certainly true of book 4. I think when you know to expect some of those repeated motifs, you can just sort of enjoy the variation that is there, because every writer has a different style, different voice, there's different lead characters. So there's actually a lot to enjoy, and there, the writers have a lot of, maybe, I don't know if fun's the right word, when sometimes they're writing about some of the more, maybe less savory elements about the country that they're setting their story in. But there's a lot of interesting texture to it, and just seeing the way different writers kind of evoke these different countries and different cultures and different settings. And again, it's sort of, if the first book was all about that mutant Americana, then I don't know what the equivalent term would be for this book, but again, that mutant lens of sort of looking at the world, or at least the world as it existed in 1986 or 1987, but through that mutated lens. There's a lot of interesting stuff, and a lot of stuff that I didn't even touch on because it's like I say, they do visit 40 countries, and there's at least a little bit written about each one of those countries. I think almost every single one. So there's a lot going on, and it is a very rich book in a lot of ways. It's still a genre book, so it's still an adventure book. It's not it's not an almanac or anything, or any kind of. I wouldn't use it as an anthropological textbook or anything like that, or I wouldn't use it as your primary source of learning about those countries, but it's still an entertaining read, and entertaining takes on just a wide variety of cultures and communities, governments, locations. And so, overall, I think it is a good book. Like I say, it improves on reread. Not my I don't like it as much as the first three. I'll admit that, but I still like it a lot. And again, I think the new stories in the Tor edition are not only really good stories in and of themselves, but they alter the pace of the book in such a way that even though it's longer, it actually feels shorter because it creates a little bit more variety. Well worth your time. I mean, obviously, if I'm doing these videos, I think all the books are worth your time. But yeah, still, it's a thumbs up from me. I realize by the clock on the wall that every video is longer than the previous one, so maybe I need to find a way to shorten these. Maybe I need to break up the book reviews. Maybe next time I'll just do the first half of book 5. I don't know. But in the meantime, I guess that's the end of this one. As always, leave a comment. Let's talk a bit. Let's get some discussion going on these books. If you're a fan, if you're intrigued and want to become a fan, whatever. I don't know. Yeah, hit me up in the comments, whatever. So next time will be episode 6 of Card Table, and it will focus on volume 5. See you then.
She doesn't have any class. She says, "Hon, what is it?" "I'm trying to visit with my pal Melinda Snodgrass. Shoot the breeze with Walter John Williams. Hang out with Howard Waldrop. I've been smarting for George R.R. Martin. His characters have so much pop. I like to go out dancing. My baby loves a bunch of authors. My heart's broken several places. Baby's just sitting there reading about aces."